Good evening, everyone. My name is Heather Warnken. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform here at the University of Baltimore School of Law. I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's event. The Center for Criminal Justice Reform supports community-driven efforts to improve public safety and address the harm and inequity caused by the criminal legal system. We strive to carry out this mission in multiple ways, including through the creation of experiential learning opportunities for our students across a range of justice reform issues, giving them the chance to partner with policymakers, grassroots organizations, and directly impacted people at the heart of this work. We also serve as a convener of critical dialogues necessary for addressing deeply entrenched challenges in our system in order to promote justice throughout the country and in Baltimore. Tonight's event exemplifies this on a number of levels. In 2017, the initial indictments surrounding the Gun Trace Task Force sent shockwaves that reverberate to this day. The harm caused by these events, which captured national attention as one of the most shocking police corruption scandals in Baltimore and perhaps this nation's history, further frayed the troubled relationship between BPD and Baltimore residents, especially in Black and brown communities. Following the release of the independent investigation into the GTTF's origins, causes, and consequences in February of 2022, we hosted Mr. Michael Bromwich, lead investigator and author of this 660-page report. By sharing key findings and fielding questions from community members, Mr. Bromwich helped to make the overwhelming volume of this document, which is critical to the past, present, and future of Baltimore, more accessible. As part of the concluding audience comment at that event, community leader Reverend Dr. Greta Willis, who is here again tonight, posed the question, where do we go from here? She echoed others who had been asking throughout the evening, how do we ensure meaningful accountability and follow-up in the months and years ahead? We're truly grateful that Mr. Bromwich has joined us once again, along with this esteemed panel and all of you for a revisiting. How far have we come, and what work remains? After a moderated discussion with our panelists, we will open this dialogue up to questions and comments from the audience members. As Professor Jaros mentioned, there are note cards available, and we encourage you to use them and hand them in at any point throughout the event, and we are happy to help with that. I would now like to invite to our stage our law school dean, Dean Ronald Weisch, who will serve as moderator. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, panelists, and thank you all of you for being here to ensure that this critical report does not just sit on a shelf, but rather is used to further real change.
Let's see, how is that volume? Is it still echoey? How's that? Pretty good? Everyone can hear me in the back? Okay. Welcome. I join Heather Warnken, the Executive Director of the Center on Criminal Justice Reform here at the University of Baltimore School of Law, in welcoming you all to our law school and to this very, very important discussion. And I want to tell you how proud we are of this Center on Criminal Justice Reform. The center has only been in existence for a little more than a year and has already made a substantial contribution to the many important discussions about criminal justice issues in the city, in the state, and around the nation. So I applaud the leadership of Heather Warnken and our faculty director, David Jaros, Professor David Jaros. We have a very distinguished panel here. I thank the police commissioner for arriving. I know you had other duties, sir, so thank you for being here. And I want to introduce our panelists and then describe how we will proceed tonight. To my extreme right is Mr. Michael Bromwich. Mr. Bromwich is senior counsel in the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson, and as Heather said, the lead author of the GTTF Independent Investigation Report from 2022. Mr. Bromwich has an extensive background investigating public corruption and advancing police reform. He spent the last 3 decades of his 40-year career conducting oversight of law enforcement, including serving as the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, where he had oversight responsibility for the FBI, the DEA, and other DOJ law enforcement agencies. He served for 6 years as the independent monitor of the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police Department, as an independent investigator of the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, and as a consultant to the Chicago Police Department on police reform. To Mr. Bromwich's left is Commissioner Michael Harrison. Michael Harrison was sworn in as the Baltimore Police Department's 41st commissioner in March 2019. Before coming to Baltimore, Commissioner Harrison served the New Orleans Police Department for nearly 3 decades, leading that department as superintendent for over 4 years. Commissioner Harrison has also served on the Police Executive Research Forum Board of Directors, where he now serves as the organization's president. To Commissioner Harrison's left is Ray Kelly. Ray is a lifelong resident of West Baltimore and an advocate for social justice and improved community police relations. As CEO of the No Boundaries Coalition, he was the driving force behind the West Baltimore Community Commission on Police Misconduct, whose report, Over-Policed Yet Underserved, was a key resource to the Department of Justice in its landmark report on the Baltimore Police Department. Ray served on the consent decree monitoring team for 2.5 years as lead community liaison, and he was recently appointed by Mayor Scott to serve on the Local Control Advisory Board, tasked with creating a path to return control of the police department to the city after 160 years of state control. And finally, to my immediate right is Natasha Dartigue. Natasha is the current Maryland State Public Defender, whose 6-year term began in July 2022. Prior to leading OPD, Ms. Dartigue worked as a trial attorney in the Juvenile, District, and Circuit Court divisions of OPD. She has served as felony trial supervisor, Deputy District Public Defender for Baltimore City, and Acting District Public Defender. She's also the first person of color to serve as the director of the Office of Public Defender here in Maryland. So obviously a very knowledgeable and distinguished panel that will help us answer the question that Heather posed a moment ago. Where do we go a year after the landmark report produced by Mr. Bromwich? And so I'm going to ask Mr. Bromwich first to provide a brief overview of how the report was produced, what were its key findings, and what were its key recommendations.
Thanks very much, Dean Weiss, and thanks to Heather Warnken for convening and doing all the work that went into planning this event. So let me talk briefly about the genesis of our investigation. As Ms. Warnken mentioned, the city of Baltimore was shocked, if it could be shocked more than it normally is, by the events of March 1st, 2017, when the Baltimore Sun and other news organs reported that 7 police officers, including supervisors from an elite unit of the Baltimore Police Department, the Gun Trace Task Force, had been arrested based on an indictment charging them with a variety of truly awful crimes, including racketeering, extortion, bribery, theft, overtime fraud, and a variety of other offenses. And the March 2017 arrests were just the first shoe to drop, because really over the course of the next 2.5 years, additional charges were brought against additional police officers. And although at the time of their arrest, the original officers said that they were not guilty and that they were going forward with contesting the case, their tune soon changed. Many of them pled guilty to racketeering charges, that they had converted not only the Gun Trace Task Force, but because of their activities, the entire department into a racketeering organization, a kind of charge normally reserved historically for organized crime families in New York and other cities. So 2.5 years, arrests, guilty pleas, and then a trial of the only 2 original defendants who had not entered guilty pleas in January and early February of 2018. And those 2 defendants, Daniel Hersel and Mr. Taylor, were convicted of the charges against them. There were still a tremendous number of questions of how did this happen? Who were these men? What caused them? What factors in their personal, professional, financial lives caused them to commit these truly egregious crimes and to become criminals with badges and guns? And a lot of people in the city were raising those quick questions on a continuing basis. As you know, as you heard through the introductions, there's been a consent decree over the Baltimore Police Department since the first half of 2017. The way consent decrees work is that a federal judge oversees them. And the federal judge overseeing the consent decree here started raising questions and concerns as early as April of 2018 about what was the interplay between all the reforms that were mandated by the consent decree on the one hand and this horrible corruption scandal that had emerged on the other. And he said, first in April of 2018, we got to get to the root of this problem. How did this level of corruption occur in the Baltimore Police Department? And he continued to press the issue. So in one of the quarterly public meetings relating to the consent decree in January of 2019, he said what the city needed, what the police department needed, what the community needed was a post-mortem, an autopsy, a, quote, post-mortem investigation that got to the root of the problem in a way that criminal investigations don't, because their purpose is to figure out whether criminal laws were violated, to bring charges based on that investigation, and then to go forward with either settlements, guilty pleas, or trials. But it's based on only a narrow slice of the information that an investigation could generate. The city had been opposed to an independent investigation for a variety of reasons, including the additional liability, the civil liability that could come along with the new disclosures made by the investigation. That changed when Commissioner Harrison came in February and March of 2019. Andre Davis was the city solicitor for the city of Baltimore, and Commissioner Harrison brought in from the FBI a new head of his Internal Affairs Bureau, Brian Nadeau. And the three of them reached a consensus that they needed, the city needed, the police department needed, a no-holds-barred, authorized investigation with no dollar limits and no time limits. And they hired us to do that. It was, and this should never be lost, this was an act of radical transparency, the likes of which you don't see very often, even in the wake of egregious police behavior or police scandal. You haven't seen it in Minneapolis following George Floyd. You haven't seen it in Louisville following Breonna Taylor. You haven't seen it in Memphis yet, although we can still hope that that will happen there. So it was and is an act of radical transparency, which should be recognized as such. And I think it really has been the broadest corruption investigation that has been undertaken since the Knapp Commission in New York in the 1970s and the Mullen Commission also in New York in the 1990s. So, what were the goals of our investigation? It was to find out who these men were, what caused them to do these awful things that they did. But also, what about the Baltimore Police Department during the era when they committed their crimes through the end of February of 2017, allowed them to get away with it for so long. So what did we do to get to the bottom of it? We did what investigators do. We collected documents from the police department and from other entities. We had really wonderful access that the FBI gave us to the debriefings they had done of the defendants, those that were interested in cooperating and ultimately entered guilty pleas. Unfortunately, we got zero cooperation from the original GTTF defendants. Now, ultimately, there were 13 Baltimore Police Department officers who were arrested and ultimately either pled guilty or were convicted at trial. But none of the original 7 agreed to meet with us, talk with us, tell us what had motivated them to move from being police officers, who presumably didn't come to the police department originally to commit crimes, but what turned them into criminals. But we did have the full cooperation, thanks in large part to Commissioner Harrison, the cooperation of the rest of the department. And we also got cooperation from many former members of the department who were under no obligation to cooperate with us because we didn't have subpoena power. We learned a lot. We did 160 plus interviews of more than 140 different people. Some of the interviews lasted all day. The average interview length was about 3 hours. And we felt that we really were able to learn a tremendous amount about the relevant history of the police department and about these individuals and the trajectory of their careers. So what did we find? We found that there was unfortunately a tradition, a culture of corruption in the department that had been recognized for years, actually had been recognized for decades. When Martin O'Malley, after he was elected in 1999, commissioned consultants from New York to come in and do a review and evaluation of the department, they noticed that there was an undercurrent of corruption in the police department going back then. And that culture was never eliminated. It was never extirpated. It was never addressed appropriately. So what we found was there was a history of doing all sorts of things that police officers should not do. Lying in court documents, lying in court testimony, lying in internal arrest reports and incident reports that were submitted within the department. It was a tradition, unfortunately, that was followed by all too many members of the Baltimore Police Department. We also found that the internal affairs capability, which is vital to the health of any law enforcement office, was consistently under-resourced and had inadequate capabilities. The people who were in the unit were not the best and the brightest. They didn't have the resources that they needed to do the job that they needed to do, and as a result, accountability in the department was not even close to what it should have been. We also found that the rewards and the promotions within the department went to those who were most productive, regardless of whether the production was based on unlawful, unconstitutional, or improper practices. So we found, and you can read this in great detail in our lengthy report or in our long but much shorter executive summary, findings. And they were really grouped under 3 categories. One were failures of supervision by the immediate supervisors of the corrupt police officers and on up the chains. We found that there was an excessive reliance for years on statistical metrics, on numerical metrics, on number of arrests, on number of guns seized, where high numbers were the goal, and how those high numbers were achieved was less important, including to a lot of senior members of the department. And then there were failures of accountability. When there were well-founded allegations against police officers, allegations of misconduct, allegations of violating the law, those were not investigated properly, and even in those cases where they were investigated properly, there were no serious consequences that came after. At the end of our report, in addition to the findings, we developed a series of 25 recommendations in every area that you can imagine in a police department: hiring, training, supervision, oversight and accountability, and several miscellaneous recommendations. And Commissioner Harrison, in a very prompt reply to our recommendations, said the department accepted them, and with one exception, which was explained, they would implement them. So what were the goals of our investigation and our report? It was really to understand the recent history of the department, going back more than 20 years, and to learn from that history. It was to show this police department's commitment to transparency, to itself, and to the community. And the goal was to develop a series of recommendations that would prompt a good faith effort to implement them, and for the commissioner and the people on his staff to report on it to the public and to others. So I think I used almost all of my 11 minutes, if not all of them, and so thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bromwich. So now I'm going to turn to the other three panelists and ask each of them to take 5 or 6 minutes each to answer the question, where are we now? What has changed since the release of the Bromwich report to provide assurance that the gun trace task force scandal could not recur? Commissioner Harrison, of course, we'll start with you.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I see some familiar faces in the audience. I'm glad to be here with my esteemed colleagues and fellow panelists. Where are we now? I will tell you, we are a totally different police department now. We are not yet where we want to be, but we are a totally different police department. We not only accepted all 25 of the recommendations that you heard Mr. Bromwich talk about, but at the time he produced the recommendations to us in our reply, 2/3, if not most of them, we said, by the way, we're already doing this. And I was not going to wait until the recommendations came to make the changes in the Baltimore Police Department. When I first joined the Baltimore Police Department in 2019, I had a conversation with the then mayor and I asked her 2 questions. What does the Baltimore Police Department need? And her one answer was, it needs a crime fighter. I need a crime fighter, somebody who can come in and reduce my murder rate. And that was the extent of the conversation. And so I said, if I were to ask the residents of Baltimore what the Baltimore Police Department needs, what would your residents say? Her answer was, they will tell you it needs to be torn apart and put back together again. I said, well, that is what we're going to do. Obviously, we could not tear the police department apart. We're already under a consent decree. But one of the first things we did is to make an assessment of what all was wrong. And in my first days, you would think my first days would be meeting with all of the residents of Baltimore and hearing from the residents, which I did. But on my first day, I spent half the night to wee hours in the morning at the FBI office. And the FBI and the U.S. Attorney in a private room well past midnight was telling me, by the way, here's what you now have taken on. By the way, this 2 or 3 page list is a list of people you should not promote or use in any way. And if you do, we separate all relationship from you and will not support you. And so I'm faced with this on my very first day because there's still members of the organization who either were still awaiting trial and or conviction or were tied to the investigation in some way, maybe not with criminal charges, but were either colleagues, supervisors, subordinates, and I needed to know who those people were. So we are now in a very much appropriate culture of accountability, a culture of transparency. By the way, they go hand in hand. Accountability without transparency is not accountability at all. But I wanted to demonstrate to the Baltimore community and to the members of our department that we could change and that we could understand why this happened. And it happened because of 5 reasons. And I put just about all of these bad things that happened into 5 buckets. It's a policy issue, a training issue, a supervision issue, a management issue, or a discipline issue, or the lack thereof of any one of those 5 things. And so everything fell into one of those 5 things. One of the things we did when I first came on is begin to fix the infrastructure, to assess talent, to make sure we can assess integrity to the extent we can know the answer to that, and put people who had both will and capacity and integrity in the right positions, and to make sure we identify those who are at some point connected with GTTF or affiliated with it in any way. And I met with every member of the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, our internal affairs, Mr. Bromwich, to make sure we understood who was connected, whether and how remote that connection could have been before we made a decision to utilize any of those people in anything the department is doing, to flesh it out. We did that, and now all the policies have been redone. All of the training has been overhauled to the nation's best practice training. All of the supervision has been overhauled, where we're now training supervisors how to supervise, how to read the red flags, and how to respond when those red flags show themselves. How to properly manage, what management really is and what we should be doing about it, and how to discipline and who's responsible for that, and how all of those 5 entities work together. And so the department now has been overhauled and the Baltimore Police Department under the consent decree is a 100% makeover of a police department. It is the equivalent of firing everybody and rehiring all new people, because we had to unlearn everything that we had learned that we had done wrong, and then reteach the new way and the correct way, which we have now done. Many people have fallen off, many people have left. Those who did not ascribe to the new correct way left. Some stayed, but we now have the infrastructure and the systems of accountability to inform us of bad things and to inform us how to reply and to respond when it's brought to our attention. That didn't exist. That now exists. And we have the people with the right skill, will, and temperament and integrity to make leadership decisions. And we have the infrastructure to either promote them with reward or remove them if they fail to respond appropriately. And I think that's where we are today, to the point that more than 45 other police departments over the past 2 years have visited the Baltimore Police Department chiefs, assistant chiefs, and executives to learn how to do what we're doing and to ask, how have you been able to do that? Because we're now debunking the myth and the false narrative that you can't reduce violent crime and reform at the same time. Baltimore is living proof of it. With the help of Mr. Bromwich, with the help of the consent decree, we have looked at what happened, why it happened, who was responsible at all levels, to include politicians, and have addressed that. And one of the greatest recommendations, I believe, is recommendation 25, where it talks about the political interference, because much of what we found was the result of political expectations of the police department, and what was unsaid was actually done, and people got the job done, even though they broke the law to do it.
All right, thank you very much, Commissioner Harrison. Let's get some additional perspectives, so I'll turn to Ray Kelly, and I'll ask you the question, where are we today? You've heard the Commissioner's perspective. How do you see it from the West Baltimore community?
So I don't disagree with a lot that the Commissioner says. For me, I'll say since 2015, with the consent decree and the conviction with the GTTF and the Bromwich report, and even with Commissioner Harrison's EPIC program, there has been a movement, however slow, towards full accountability. So we're talking now, we have new police accountability boards and administrators. So all of that is poison us to kind of inject what's been missing in all of my years of advocacy, is that fear of consequence for the police department. I personally feel that Baltimore City does have the blueprint for community policing. We have the training models in place that the country is looking to see, but I also feel that we're kind of stuck in where we're actually trying to go with these reforms. So we've had a lot of setbacks, I'll say, in that time as well, where we didn't have the same focus on reform that we had in 2015 and 16 until George Floyd. So once again, there was a trauma that mobilized people to get engaged and respond to this. There's no person that was elected in 2020 that didn't run on this aspect of police reform. So for a lot of us who've been doing this work for a long time, we have this desire to be where we were pre-2015. And we question what is the measure of success. And I tried to be transparent and put the question out there early, but in 2014, there were only 211 murders. The budget was $400,000. Officers made 13,000 arrests. And now, as we claim our success, we have to recognize that last year there were 337 murders. The budget is now $550 some odd million, and all of that, we only had about 3,600 arrests, where we have to kind of establish what is the goalposts. What are we looking to achieve from all of this, and what is an appropriate measure of success? So I think we're on the right path. It's slow rolling. We've had so much drama in Baltimore City, and I think once again we have to reassess, for lack of a better term, on where we're actually trying to get. So for me, I see a lot because I'm part of the process. I see the great trainings and things that are happening, but I'm also still seeing what's happening on the streets. So even though I'm part of the GVRS, I see how crime and violence is actually down last year in my own neighborhood, but then I also see the overall numbers for the city. And for me personally, I'm hesitant still to say that it's been a success. I can only say that we're making movement in the right direction, and hopefully we'll be able to say we're that model of effective community policing, but personally I don't feel we're there yet.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's an important perspective, a complicated perspective, acknowledging progress, but asking the question, how long before we get to a level that's acceptable? I'll turn now to Natasha Darking, who obviously has the perspective of supervising public defenders throughout the state, but especially here in Baltimore City, who, of course, see the police at work every day and the product of police work in individual cases. And so I would welcome your answer to the question, where are we today? How far have we come?
Well, first let me say thank you, Dean. Thank you, Director Warkin, for the invitation to be here today. And I do speak from a different perspective. And I speak from the perspective not only as state public defender, but I speak from the perspective as a criminal defense attorney who served in Baltimore City for 26 years prior to taking this position. So I personally have been through several police commissioners, and I would say to you a few things. To give you perspective in terms of progress over time, when we hear these reports and we see these movies and these stories, please be clear and understand that these are stories and true lives of which we have heard for years and years and years. And we have challenged and attempted to challenge, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, the veracity of these officers. So when I tell you in terms of how much we have progressed, I'll give you a couple of analogies. Some people may say a drop in the bucket. If you're on some sort of weight loss plan over the course of years, I would say if you've only lost ounces, not pounds. And it is disheartening, but it is the reality of where we are. I would also say that I do believe from my professional experience, especially with the commissioner, I've had the opportunity to work with him on different task force, that he speaks in earnest in terms of the work that he is doing within the department. But I also speak from the fact that it is what has been seen, especially through the GTTF, is a cancer that exists within the department, and simply excising a piece of it, I would not be certain to say that it's been resolved. So we have to speak as to, okay, what is happening within those that remain, right? Because we didn't totally wipe everybody out and start fresh, right? So there is those that remain that we must also speak of. I also speak to the perspective as a member of the Public Defender's Office that when the Department of Justice came to Baltimore, they came to us, essentially to find the stories, to find the people. There was a period of time when they were meeting with us weekly, and then bi-weekly as things progressed, to really try to find out what was happening in the city, and we shared with them the stories. And I would say, no disrespect to my colleague, but in terms of assessing a measure of success, we must never determine success by the number of arrests. That should never, ever be the standard on which we determine success. I also say that when we talk about public safety, we have to make sure that we always remember that the role of the police is to respond to crime. The police do not prevent crime. And you think about communities where individuals feel the safest, those are communities that have resources such as strong schools, have access to adequate health care, all those things that make a community strong. Those are the things that are going to affect in terms of what crime is in Baltimore especially. When we want to talk about a true measure of success, I would say that it would have to be talking about increased transparency. My experience and my colleagues, especially those who work in Baltimore City, is in the courtroom. And the reality is that we are still struggling with getting the disclosures, with getting information that is being collected so that we can effectively use it and challenge it in court. I bring to you an example that happened just last month. There's an officer who essentially, it was a 1983 suit of excessive force. It was finally settled in March of this year for $250,000. This officer was still brought forth to court to testify, and essentially the case was dismissed as a result of the judge saying that, you know what, I don't find this officer credible, right? We should not be at the point where it has to be the judge that is saying this officer is not credible. That determination should be made long before the person comes to court, even before the person is arrested, that this person should not be encountering individuals who are not credible. They should not be interacting within the communities to begin with. So I say, you know, again, how far have we gone? At best, a snail's pace. The only thing that for us, and I say us, I'm not only speaking about the Public Defender's Office, but I'm talking about the communities that serve. The only thing that really has happened is that somebody's acknowledged what people have been saying for decades and decades and decades that has been occurring here in Baltimore City.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Dartey. I should note that we invited the Office of the State's Attorney in Baltimore City to participate in this discussion because that would have been a relevant perspective as well, and they did not accept the invitation. So I want to drill down now on certain aspects, especially aspects of Mr. Bromwich's report, and I'm going to pose questions principally to Commissioner Harrison, but then ask the other three panelists to react on each of these issues. First, I want to talk about the use of specialized police units. Specialized squads. Now, of course, the Gun Trace Task Force was such a unit. It was a plainclothes unit with this very specialized task. Mr. Bromwich found that task forces like that have the potential to breed corruption and abuse. And we've seen this not just in Baltimore, but around the country. We were all horrified, as Heather Warnken said, by the fatal beating of Tyree Nichols in Memphis by officers who were members of the Scorpion Squad there, which was a specialized plainclothes unit. Now, the Gun Trace Task Force no longer exists in Baltimore, but Commissioner Harrison, are there still these kind of specialized plainclothes units in the Baltimore Police Department? And if so, how do you oversee them to make sure that we don't see those abuses again?
Thank you. There are some specialized units in the Baltimore Police Department. There are not plain clothes. And when we talk about plain clothes, we're talking about in casual civilian attire. Even though we have those specialized units, they are in regalia that is clearly marked police, and they are clearly identified as police. Having led two police departments, by the way, the New Orleans Police Department, in its consent decree, investigation findings, the DOJ labeled New Orleans the most troubled department in America. Then I came to Baltimore and they said something very similar about Baltimore.
Don't take it personally.
I don't take it personally. It is much needed, and there's great value in it when the persons are selected appropriately. Skill, will, temperament, integrity. And then when they are properly supervised, by people who have the appropriate supervision skills to appropriately supervise. And then management creates the appropriate policies for how they are to be governed, and there's the appropriate disciplinary system for when they don't do it. Because the infrastructure and systems of accountability are built to inform us when they step out of bounds, and it informs us of how to respond when it's brought to our attention. Nothing will ever be perfect, but and perfect shouldn't be the enemy of good. We should make sure we have the systems of accountability to inform us, but we should make sure the infrastructure is there for us to respond when it is brought to our attention. And so they are very necessary. Yes, we have them. They are closely supervised. One of the first things I did after the incident and the murder in Memphis was to make sure we reassess our specialized units, to make sure we brought them in front of our community so our community can see the people who are doing the work. We brought them in front of the judge in our consent decree public hearing and had them speak directly to the judge and answer questions that the judge might have. I wanted to make sure our training was superior training, to make sure that they are out there performing what needs to be done in a very constitutional way. And that the supervisors are actually supervising, managers are managing, and that we are correcting them when we find that they step out of bounds. So they can work when they are not supervised, as in the case of Memphis, as in the case of the Rampart case of Los Angeles that many of you may be familiar with, as in the case of many other places. It was the lack of supervision, and the lack of supervision came out of inadequate policies and a poor or inept disciplinary system. When you put all of those together, yes, those specialized units will run afoul, and corruption can begin to fester and spread like a cancer. But the way to hold them accountable is for all of the things that I told you in front: policy, training, supervision, management, and discipline. All have to, but the infrastructure has to be there to support that, and the right people who are not afraid to levy discipline against people when they mess up and make mistakes.
I was interested to hear you react immediately to say there are still such units, but not plainclothes. What's the significance of
So
those
they're
there?
plainclothes units, as in undercover officers, which are plainclothes, which operate as in covert capacity. There's covert, which is I don't want you to know I'm a police officer. I might be doing a surveillance, looking through a pair of binoculars in a nondescript vehicle. That's to do surveillance, but that's not to do enforcement. There's undercover operations where members pretend to be perhaps drug dealers to buy drugs and or guns and or any kind of contraband to make the criminal case against a would-be seller or distributor or trafficker. That's undercover, which are all plainclothes operations, obviously, to pretend to be someone other than the police. Plainclothes we use for surveillance, but we don't use for enforcement. So at the moment of engaging a resident or a community member, we want members who are in uniform clearly identified as police, Baltimore Police. And so we have specialized units, but in the enforcement capacity, they are in uniform. In surveillance capacity, we do have people who work in plain clothes. But you're correct, that has to be very, very closely supervised and monitored and regulated to make sure that they are staying within bounds, following the rules and the policies. And we have to make sure that we're even checking on things like financial status to make sure that people are not tempted to solve a family problem or a personal problem through their work.
Mr. Bromwich had a series of kind of oversight mechanisms in his report. So I'll ask him, as you hear Commissioner Harrison talk about these units today, are you reassured that it's under control and properly supervised?
Well, I don't know. I have a great deal of respect for Commissioner Harrison, but I haven't gone back and actually looked to the changes that have been made in the supervision of the specialized units. But I do know from work that we did towards the end of our review, as we tried to bring some of the events up to date, that the GTTF scandal and the arrest of 13 officers did send shockwaves through the department, and I think created a presumption, which is a healthy one for not only this police department but others, against plainclothes units or even against specialized units that are involved in enforcement work. And so what I have seen is a seriousness about the risks that such units pose for the integrity of the police department and for the safety of the community in Baltimore through the acceptance of some of our recommendations. But the risks obviously remain. And of the categories that Commissioner Harrison mentioned as key, I would really emphasize selection, initial selection of the members of the unit. The members of the GTTF and the other officers who were corrupt, many of them had very thick internal affairs files. They should never have been in plainclothes enforcement units because they had shown a willingness over time to violate policy and to break the law. And so I think as important as supervision is, and it's incredibly important, and as important as accountability is, it's incredibly important, selecting the right people at the outset is in some ways the toughest and the most significant of all, to have the highest chance that the people in the unit are people of high integrity and they will continue to engage in only appropriate and constitutional conduct rather than violating policy and breaking the law.
Natasha Dartigue, your public defenders, your colleagues, are seeing cases that emanate from the work of the current specialized units. Do you share Commissioner Harrison's confidence that the proper controls are in place?
That's such a trick question. But, so I guess what I would definitely say is what is, I would add would be the issue of transparency, right? Because the true accountability is in the transparency.
Yes.
And when we speak about the shock wave, right, there's two different types of shock waves. There's the shock wave that says, oh, I might get caught. And there's the other shock wave that sends you like, oh, I better not do this, right? So we have to really question which of the two. And I would say there was a combination of both that probably went through the department. The key really is to transparency. You know, if all this is happening on the inside, but it stays on the inside, what good does it really do? We are still struggling as defense attorneys to get that information. So for us, you know, to hear that these things are happening, it's really great. To really know it and see it, I can't say that we actually feel it or see it to the extent that we really need to, so that it can affect and really help the citizens of Baltimore.
Okay, let's move on to the issue that Ray Kelly and Natasha Dartigue, really each of the panelists raised, which was how do you measure success? One of the key findings of Mr. Bromwich's report is that there was an undue reliance on quantifiable factors, the number of guns, the amount of drugs, the number of arrests. And he criticizes, Mr. Bromwich will feel free to correct me, but he criticizes that approach as opposed to looking at the quality of arrests and really the quality of enforcement. So I'll ask Commissioner Harrison first and then ask others to react. Have you altered the incentives in the department so as not to rely simply on the quantity, the guns, the drugs, et cetera?
Absolutely. It's the reward system. And the culture that existed and the culture that I'm trying hard to kill and to bury, and hopefully it will stay buried, is the culture that rewards the officers for quantitative productivity. How many arrests do you make? And so that was the driving factor. And officers were performing like that because that was the reward system, and that was how it was declared that you were a good officer, you know, a good officer. And so we've now changed the reward system, not just to say, okay, people say, you know, an officer saved a life today, but we have community engagement and community policing awards and rewards, and we're celebrating officers who are doing the small things that change lives and prevent crime as much, if not more, than the officers who might even save a life or get a gun off the street from somebody who would have used it to harm someone. And so, yes, we had to change that, and that's a heavy, heavy culture to change because officers grow through a department and matriculate up through the ranks, being called good or get assignments and being awarded the good assignment by how much they produced. And that was the culture of the department. One of the first things we did was did away with that. We don't want to really talk about the number of arrests we make. Yes, it's way down, but we're making more, better arrests with quality. My goal is to make sure if we have to make an arrest, which should be the last resort, that is for someone who has violated the law, and that that person should face consequences. But we're not gauging the success on how much we make. A measure of success to me is citizen satisfaction, officer productivity. For example, yes, last year we made more gun arrests and took more guns off the street than we did when we had 600 more officers. When we had more than 3,000 officers, we took about 2,600 guns off the street. With 600 fewer officers, we did that last year. But we did it without using force. So we made more arrests for guns, but the uses of force went down. Complaints from citizens went down, and cases accepted by the state's attorney went up. So when the use of force went down and the complaints went down, but the productivity went up, that's a measure of quantitative success that we can quantify. Now, we have to make sure those cases make it throughout the criminal justice system. So we're not rewarding officers for volume of work. We're rewarding officers for doing good work, for creating citizen satisfaction and citizens' compliments and commendations about things that are as important, if not more important, like community policing. Like, how is your community responding to the way you perform your policing duties in that community? And so changing that award system and reward system is key for changing culture.
Now, Mr. Kelly, in your opening remarks, I thought you were expressing dismay that there were far fewer arrests now than in pre-Freddie Gray days, pre-2015. Is that right? Are you looking for more arrests?
So I'll say this. I was taught long ago there are three types of lies. You have lies, you have damn lies, and you have statistics.
This is one of those quotes that it's either
what I
recent
was simply
or-
doing was having a comparative analysis, and I'm glad that the talk is about arrest numbers, because anyone that knows me knows I'm always don't arrest anybody, but there's always been this divide in our city of do not persecute our community versus we need to get these violent criminals off the street. So that comparison is to answer the question, what is your measure of success? 100 and some less murders and 150 million less dollars with 5 times as many arrests, or 150 more murders, 150 million more dollars for less arrests. So I think that's the whole gist of what we're trying to get with that question is, what is our expectation of success? I've told the commissioner a million times that I commend him because in my 15 years of doing this work, he's been here the longest. He's almost at a point where, you remember I told you, I was like, the shelf life for a police commissioner here is 2 years. Talk to me after you cross that. And he's still here, where next year, 5 years, he moves into a place of accountability.
Stop.
And I'm going to be coming to him.
Stop.
But all of that is progress, but like the public defender said, it's at a snail's pace. What are our expectations? What are the benchmarks? Where are we headed?
Yeah. Commissioner, you want
I
to?
want to add to that, and I don't mean to go out of turn, but a couple of things. Murder is not the result of good or bad policing, and it is not the result of police deployment or investigations. It is the symptom of a disease, and it is the manifestation of all that's wrong in a person's life and life conditions that causes them to go out and to do that. That's number one. But when we made those massive amount of arrests, we were doing it wrong. We were violating people's rights. And we were arresting people who didn't commit crimes. We were arresting people without the appropriate probable cause, and we were doing it. And if there are people who want to tie that low number of murders in those years to the high amount of arrests in those years, it's because we were doing it wrong. And we were violating rights. We were arresting people for no reason. We were rounding people up on the corner and just putting them in jail because they did not follow the police instruction. That's what put us in the consent decree. Now we are making far fewer arrests, hopefully the right arrests, doing it the right way. And by the way, the crime is going down. Now, it is not going down fast enough. Let me be the first to say. And yes, we have a long way to go with reform and making the department what we really wanted. Yeah, we're making progress, but I'm not bragging on it, but I'll be the first to say we have a long way to go. But we did so much wrong back then the way we did it. And the officers were taking these decoded cues from higher up officials in the department and higher up officials in government who were sending these coded messages, go out and do this. And the numbers went down, and they did more of it, and it went down further. And they were rewarded for it. And now we're paying the price.
I take it when you refer to political interference or political pressure, it's that desire of politicians to be able to say, this number of guns were seized, this amount of drugs were seized. It's that they want the quantifiable measures and you're looking for quality.
Well, it's good to quantify that so we can know for the sake of knowing. It's not good to quantify that to reward a particular officer for going out doing it, because then the officer will then sometimes, if unsupervised and the integrity is not there, will take shortcuts because they seek the reward instead of just doing the work.
All right, so integrity is a key word
Yes.
here. And you spoke about a culture of integrity and accountability that you strive for. So I want to ask Natasha Dartigue, are you and your colleagues in the Public Defender's Office seeing police officers testify with more integrity?
I like that question.
So once again, it's not a yes and no question, but I do want to comment on one point, and I will answer your question. So essentially, we talk a great deal about reducing crime, and we only continually talk about one component of it, and that is law enforcement. The true key to public safety, and that is only one piece of it, and I would dare to argue that that is not even the largest piece. Because when we know about crime, the true nature of crime is the issue of poverty that exists in these communities. And if we only talk about law enforcement, we're never going to get any real solution, right? We need to talk about how we're going to improve the schools, how we're going to increase economic opportunities, how we're going to increase the health of these communities, because that is where we're going to do some good in terms of public safety and really reducing crime. So I really wanted to emphasize that, because we continue to have the same narrative and think that we're going to have a different result in Baltimore City, and we are not. We are definitely not. In terms of, now I got to ask you to remind me the question.
The question was, are the police officers in court testifying with more integrity, or as the expression goes, are they testifying?
So the challenges that we face is in the fact that we're not receiving these disclosures in a timely manner. We're receiving these disclosures in an inconsistent way. So there are officers out there who do have these integrity issues that we are in the courtroom and we're unaware. So it's not that they're testifying with greater integrity. We're just not receiving this information in a timely manner.
Is your beef with the state's attorney's office or the police department?
Well, I don't like that word. I use beef, but I would say that, and I would hope to, after this, really continue this dialogue, especially with my district public defender who is present, Marguerite Linnell, and the commissioner for Baltimore City, is essentially one of the negatives that we've seen as we've had a turnover in the police department, are that those who are more collaborative and working and sharing of information and understanding that we have to come to a middle of the road are no longer there or no longer operating in the same capacity. So in terms of where we can align the Public Defender's Office and the police department, that is one space to better communication so that there is an easier flow of information.
Mr. Bromwich, from your perspective, having really done a deep dive in this department, how crucial is training, especially on this issue of integrity?
Well, training is vital. Training is vital for any aspect of policing. But what we found was that historically there had been virtually no ethics training, and there had been virtually no focus on the many corruption scandals in the police department. I've found through the work that I've done both in the public sector and the private sector that if you don't push in the face of both new members and existing members of an organization that bad things have happened here, and if you're not careful, bad things will happen again, that increases the likelihood that people will do bad things. So I've had an opportunity to sit in on new training that has been developed by by the Baltimore Police Department Academy that does those things in a way that hadn't been done before. There is fundamental ethics training that is practical ethics training that doesn't talk about general concepts in the history of philosophy, which are meaningless and don't resonate with police officers, but instead the ethics of doing their job and the scandals that have existed in the history of the department. That's real world training. That's bringing life to the members of the department. It's relevant to their experience and the experience of their colleagues in the department.
You know,
And so I think that's a real improvement. And there's a specific kind of training that Commissioner Harrison developed in New Orleans and brought here, which is what's called EPIC training, which teaches police officers that they have a duty to intervene if one of their colleagues is engaging in the excessive use of force or another kind of misconduct. And it specifically tells line officers that they are to intervene with their superiors if they're doing something wrong. That is not the way police departments were trained historically. That is a major sort of thought innovation for police departments. I sat in on the training, other members of my team sat in on the training, Judge Berdar has sat in on the training, and it is a real step forward in training. But you can never relax about training. You constantly need to put in the time, you need to be aware of developments in policing throughout the country, you've got to adapt, you've got to grow, you've got to train.
Thank you. My colleagues, Ms. Warnken, Professor Jaros, are going to hand me index cards. These are questions from the audience. I've not seen them, but that means I need to take out my glasses to read them. And by the way, can I just observe, members of the audience may know this. Professor Jaros is inviting anybody to give him more questions if you'd like. The Police Training Academy today is in the old law school building, a block over on Maryland Avenue. So, Commissioner Harrison, I take it that if we were to walk into the training of police officers today, it would look different than it did 5, 10 years ago.
Absolutely. One of the first things I did is to tell the mayor, please show me our police academy. And she brought me to a building on Northern Parkway, which at one time belonged to the school board, the school system, but it was declared unfit for humans to be in it, so they gave it to the police department.
Okay. We've got some great...
And so it was so bad that I said we need a police academy immediately. And long story short, we landed in the former law school here at University of Baltimore. It's a first-class facility. It has first-class amenities to make it an institution of higher learning. In addition to moving into the law school and retrofitting it to fit all of our needs, I hired Gary Gardner, who I believe has a doctorate in higher education, to be the academic director of it. We had never done that. I had done that in New Orleans. We did that here. Handles all the academic rigor. So although we have a commander who runs the command and control day-to-day operations, the academic rigor, student evaluations, teacher evaluations, all are done by Gary. And so it's a partnership, but we absolutely want to make it like an institution of higher learning where the adult learning model is taught and everything that's national best practice is brought to the Baltimore Police Academy. It is night and day from where we were.
Okay. So some questions from the audience. First for Ms. Darkey. How do you foresee the passage of Anton's Law, which would open access to police disciplinary records, affecting how defense attorneys litigate? Is it a tool to use?
Oh, it is absolutely a tool to use, but throughout the state of Maryland, we have 24 jurisdictions, so we have 24 state's attorneys, and how it's applied in every jurisdiction, every police department is a challenge that we face, but it is a positive first step.
Okay. Let me ask, I guess, Commissioner Harrison in the first instance, how has the $22 million in GTTF settlements helped to change the culture and curb behavior? You know, we have, in torts class, we learned that you create incentives for people to use reasonable care. Is that, those financial payouts, putting pressure on the police to do their job in a way that doesn't give rise to those settlements?
Well, it absolutely puts pressure on us, but it is my job and the members of my executive team and command staff to go and educate the members of the department about what we are paying out in settlements, because that money could have been used for so many other things. And this is, to show them the consequence of bad behavior, poor performance, bad actions. And, it's not just those settlements, but look at what happened to the lives and careers of those officers. Look at what happened to the people that they hurt and are killed and are misused and mistreated. And so we have to talk about that with the members of our agency. Because when it comes to that money, I could have bought another 100 cars. I could have built 2 new police stations. But when I get told, no, we can't give you money for 100 cars, we can't build your new police station because we're paying out these settlements, it's what I have to go and educate the members of my department. This is exactly why we have to perform well. This is why we have to have integrity. We have to do it right, because the opportunity is now lost for you to have all the things you could have and all the things that maybe another police department might have. I have to say no to you because we're paying this out. So yes, we have to educate them on the realities of what happens when these things happen, and we have to pay out these lawsuits and these settlements. And it's keeping us from having the things we should have and the things we might need sometimes.
It's interesting that you raise the issue of the budget for the police department. A couple of years ago, there was a movement to, quote unquote, defund the police. I want to ask Ray Kelly how you see it from a community perspective. Should the police department budget be increased, decreased, or is it about right now?
So for me, the defund has kind of been a long time advocacy effort to invest less in punitive and law enforcement and more into those root issues that lead to crime. So we just put out a report, The Long Game, that we had 6 public safety recommendations with none had to do with law enforcement. It was about investing in the schools. It was about investing to reverse the war on drugs through addiction treatment and education and things like that. Huge piece, like the commissioner said, the politics here influence everything negatively. So that's a big issue that we have to address, as well as people that live in the city being involved and being engaged in the processes that's going to actually bring us to where we're trying to get. So my perspective kind of comes from day to day. I do have the privilege of access, so I do know what's going on. I've witnessed Greg and his trainings, and I think the trainings as written are excellent. I think the mandates are excellent, the policies. We did a lot of engagement with community members to fine-tune these policies, but when we get to the point of actually implementing, then we kind of run back into that cultural type of wall. And those are the things that now we are faced with overcoming, is seeing the things we've written translate into street level performance and that type of change.
Okay. Question from the audience, and I'll pose this to Ms. Darkey. What about individuals who are incarcerated because of this form of bad policing? From your perspective, are you seeing enough remedy to the wrongs that were uncovered in the Bromwich report?
Not to the directly impacting the individuals, and definitely not in a situation where it impacts the community. The unfortunate reality is that justice moves extremely, extremely slowly, and you often have situations where individuals make a compromise to, kind of have the opportunity to go on with their lives, that they can't wait for that postponement so you can get the police records or whatever the circumstances are, and then they want to move forward with their lives and resolve the issue in whatever capacity that they can. That means individuals are taken from their communities, or that they return to their communities with a criminal record. So they forever bear the scars of these situations. But I did want to comment about when we talk about the $22 million in settlements from the GTTF, one of the things I think people don't fully realize, and I feel the pain personally because I'm a resident of Baltimore City, is the fact that it does not come out of the police department's budget. It comes out of the city's general fund. So if we're talking about financial accountability, really kind of feeling the pain of having to pay the money, then I would say perhaps a tweak would be that when we have these settlements, that a portion is actually coming out of the police department budget, because then perhaps that would be a greater incentive to change the conduct.
Commissioner Harrison, you're not for that.
Well, I don't want to say I'm for it or not for it. What I will say is a cut to the police department budget is a cut in salaries and a cut in positions. And so our entire budget is based on salaries and benefits for the officers. We have some contractual provisions like the purchase of body cameras and the maintenance of the cameras. The healthcare, the pension system, all fall within our budget. The rental of the buildings and the rental of the vehicles we use all come out of our budget. So it's either taking away officer positions, it's taking away buildings, or it's taking away vehicles. But so any cut for us is a cut in the personnel or cut in the facilities or the equipment, the stuff that we use to do the job. There's no extra money that we can cut. It's either reduce the number of officers, and with the crime rate the way it is, I think we're looking to get more officers, not have fewer officers.
So let's talk about hiring. That seems like it's a key issue. It comes up regularly in the consent department,
Yes.
the consent decree hearings before Judge Berdar. Mr. Bromwich, you wrote, as it was really your first recommendation, BPD should consistently follow established and standardized processes for conducting background investigations of applicants, and under no circumstances should it lower its standards even in times of urgent need. I take it you made that the first recommendation because you saw that as foundational to everything else.
Well, yeah, we took them in sequence, so hiring, training, supervision, accountability. But no, we think it's an extremely important lesson to remember. And the lesson is that in those departments that lowered their standards when they were hungry for additional officers, you could bank on it that 10, 12 years later, you would have a surge in corruption because those officers should never have been hired. So the history teaches us that lesson, that even in times of great need for a police department, you change the standards, you lower the standards, you lower the bar to hiring at your peril, and you will pay the price down the road.
Commissioner Harrison, you still need to hire more officers?
I still need to hire more officers. We're budgeted for 2604. We're at 2115, so that's a big delta of more than 470. So yes, we're very short. We need to hire, but we agree. Under no circumstances are we going to lower the standards. We want to make sure we're attracting and hiring the best and the brightest. Now, we have made it competitive. We are the highest paid in the state. We offer more financial incentives to come. We offer more financial incentives to stay. But we're competing against a lot of different nuances, and even in the private sector. We're competing against the private sector. So we agree. That was one of the first things we just said. We strongly agree. I had that same commitment in New Orleans, even though we're short. We would rather have a shortage with more people who are doing the job correctly than to have more people and have people not doing the job correctly.
So as I said, hiring has come up a lot in the consent decree
Yes.
oversight hearings. I want to ask about the consent decree and really ask everybody, what's the relationship between the recommendations and the aftermath of the Bromwich report and the imperatives created by the consent decree? Are they overlapping? Are they in contrast or in tension with each other?
If I can start, I would say that they are not really overlapping, but they're complementary. And the recommendations are a little more specific in what a police department should do in a specific area, as opposed to the more general mandate sometimes in a consent decree that says, we should have very high standards. A recommendation in the report was a little more specific and nuanced. So they're not overlapping, but they're supportive and complementary.
Mr. Bromwich?
Yeah, I viewed them as mutually reinforcing. I was well aware of the requirements of the consent decree because, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was the independent monitor of the DC Police Department, and I've been working with the Justice Department in various cities for a long time. And the requirements in consent decrees are difficult to achieve. They're time-consuming to achieve. They require sort of the equivalent of institutional earthquakes in terms of changing culture, changing policies, changing training, and so forth. The goal in formulating our recommendations was, are they doable? And are they doable now or in the near future? It's not to say they're quick fixes, but are these things, I've seen reports, I'm sure all of you have seen reports, with 150 recommendations, which are drafted in great aspirational tones, but sometimes they don't make any sense. Sometimes the recipient doesn't really understand what they mean, and even if they do understand what they mean, they're really not capable of implementing them. Our goal was the opposite. Let's have a discrete number of clearly expressed and clearly understandable recommendations that we believe the police department in 2022, when we published our report, were doable and doable within a short period of time.
Mr. Kelly or Ms. Dartique, any perspectives on the consent decree?
No, I think the mandates and the consent decree align perfectly with Mike's recommendations. We actually had him at a community meeting and did a comparative, and so the consent decree was department-wide, so to speak, and they covered what all officers would do. And I think Mike's report kind of specified, one, identifying the culture that was present at that time and what things you can do to eliminate having those issues specifically that came through GTTF.
All right. Natasha, unless you have something, I'll move on.
I would just say that it requires it to be intentional. Although the consent decree was addressing specific conduct at a particular period in time, it does in fact address best practices, how we should be engaging with the community on a regular basis. But it does require it to be intentional. I think we do a disservice to the effort if we just keep saying how hard it is as opposed to just getting it done.
Let me say, it's about 7:30. We're going to go for another 10 minutes because we started 10 minutes late. So if everyone is happy with this, we're going to continue for about 10 minutes. So many good questions from the audience. And here's a really important one. Police violence largely still disproportionately harms black people. How much is race addressed in police training? I'll ask the commissioner.
Well, now it is addressed. There was a time where it was not addressed, and police commissioners, police leaders did not address it, and likewise the instructors didn't address it. It is addressed now because the disparate treatment, because of the disparate stops and searches and arrests, were largely people of color and minority communities. And so we have had to unlearn through watching what we did and talking about what we did in the training, unlearn the bad performance and really reteach and relearn the appropriate way to engage. And everything is not enforcement. We have to engage in non-enforcement type of engagement. And so we've retrained the Department on Use of Force, stops, searches, and arrests, Fourth Amendment, to make sure that what we're doing according to the Constitution. But we want to make sure the policies are clear and the mandate from the top office, from my office, is clear. We want to engage, and we're not telling officers to just go out and stop everybody, and we're not trying to quantify, to determine what a good officer is by quantifying how much work they do or how many stops they make. And so because we know that's always going to be disparate treatment. There will always be some level of disparate treatment, but we're trying to make sure we teach officers. We have bias-free policing. We have implicit bias training to get officers to understand their own biases and how that affects people. But we want to hear from community members. We bring community members in to the training to tell us, this is how it makes me feel when you do this. This is how our community feels when you do this.
Okay.
And so it helps. It doesn't fix it all, but we think it helps.
May I add a
Yes,
fix?
please.
And I know there's to a small degree, and my challenge is to expand it to a greater degree, that inherent is in the problem in terms of especially policing of black and brown communities is that the only time you engage these communities are at these moments of great trauma and stress. We have two phenomenal institutions, historically Black colleges, just encouraging to engage, especially with Black men in different spaces, in different circumstances. We have Coppin on the west and Morgan on the east, really expanding programs in which officers are engaging in that capacity so that you see Black men when they are hopeful at their best and their brightest, not only when you're chasing them down Greenmount.
I have a very specific question for Mr. Bromwich. An audience member wants to know where to find the executive summary of your report.
gttinvestigation.org.
Okay.
It is also on the BPD website, and so you can find that report on the front page of our website also.
I have a question for Ray Kelly, because as I said in my introduction of you, you're involved now in the effort to implement the change in state law that transfers control of the police department from the state to the city. How is that going? What's the path for that, and how is that going to make a difference?
I'm glad you answered that question. Because despite 82% of the voting population in support of bringing local control politics, Commissioner Harrison kind of injected this amendment at the last moment. We're still trying to fight it in Annapolis. It's probably going to go on the shelf. So despite the will of the people, local control isn't happening. I wasn't part of the conversation about switching this effort from local control advisory board to powers of the commissioner advisory board, but somehow between November and March, that legislation changed from local control of BPD to the powers of the commissioner of BPD. So personally, I'd like to know what changed over the years. I've never heard talk of kind of addressing how you operate the police department. I've said publicly many times, I think we're on the right track, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if it needs to be fixed, I want it fixed in Baltimore City, not in Annapolis. So that's just where I stand. I mean,
Well, I'm happy to answer your question. The amendment to it was to ensure that local control is given because I support local control. In New Orleans, the city council had local control of the police department. I believe it should happen here in Baltimore. I do not believe that local control means that the city council or any other elected official manages the police department, the day-to-day operations where they legislate how deployment should happen. The things I went to school for many years for and run 2 city police departments to learn how to do and select the brightest people who've gotten the best training around the world to help lead the department to do. It doesn't mean the dictate of this is, we will legislate how you create deployment strategies, how you or what you investigate, and how you promote, select the day-to-day operations of a police department. But I absolutely support local control.
so I think my question then becomes, the city council doesn't do that to any agency in Baltimore City. They don't micromanage. They kind of address issues brought to them by public through the whole legislative process in Baltimore City, where I'm personally, and it's just me, maybe I'm naive and I talk a lot about politics. I can't stand it, but is there a political motivation? Is somebody say something? Let me know. I'll talk to them.
No, there's no political motivation. I support local control. Once again, I wanted to make sure that the police department, while I'm here and for future police commissioners, that the city can hire and attract, should it need to ever attract, a competent police commissioner to come to Baltimore and actually do the job that the police commissioner is here to do, and not be told through legislation how to deploy, how to create, how to investigate, how to supervise, monitor, promote, demote, fire, and discipline. And we've we've been in Baltimore long enough to know that the potential for that always exists.
Let me be even blunter than Commissioner Harrison. Mayors and members of city councils do not know how to manage police departments. Full stop. Many think they do. Full stop. They don't. Full stop. And what we saw during our investigation is attempts by high-ranking city officials, including mayors, including members of the city council, to determine promotions of certain people, to ensure demotions of certain people, to lobby for transfers of certain people, which very much undermines management's ability to make the right decisions based on the merits. And so that's why our 25th recommendation, it was not last but least, it was last but not least. Politicians should keep their nose out of the operations of police departments.
All right, in our closing minutes here, I want to highlight the issue of victims and the treatment of victims in the course of policing. Our colleague Heather Warnken spearheaded the Department of Justice report that looked at that in the context of the Baltimore Police Department and found that there were flaws in the way victims were treated. They were not always treated with respect, and that could adversely affect community confidence in policing. Commissioner, do you feel that you have adequately addressed those recommendations?
I would say that we have adequately made the commitment to address it. We know that there's a long way to go. We recognize that we did not treat victims appropriately. It's what landed us into a consent decree. And it's what has torn and diminished and reduced the trust between police and the community. We own that, but we're working to correct that. It's not perfect, but we know we have a long way to go, but we're fully committed to making sure that we get it right.
And I think there was a follow-up in Mr. Bromwich's report, sort of parallel matter, a recommendation that victims of the Gun Trace Task Force scandal, of the abuse and corruption there, that those victims should actually have a voice in training to sort of show the cadets this is what can happen when police go off the rails. Has that happened?
We've had members of the community come in and address the police department and new recruits and veteran officers in service. I can't say specifically if it's the actual victims of the Gun Trace Task Force, but it has. We know for a fact, because I've confirmed that there have been people to come in and say, this is how you have made us feel when you do what you do, and you do it this way. I don't know for certain if it's specific members who are victims, specific victims of the Gun Trace Task Force.
We're at 7:38. I want each of the panelists, each of the four panelists, to give us 1 minute. We'll go to 7:42. Give us 1 minute to summarize your perspective on. You go first?
No, I go last.
Mr. Bromwich, tell us how you
Well,
think.
again, I want to thank you, Dean, and Heather Warnken for pulling this together. I think it's vital to keep talking about the lessons of the Gun Trace Task Force scandal and to be talking about the progress that the police department is making but needs to continue to make to address some of the root causes of what we saw during our investigation and review. And again, to continue for the police department to continue to work to implement those recommendations in a responsible way.
Commissioner?
I want to thank you for allowing me to be here. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to all of you. Look, we are committed to giving you the department that you pay for, the department you deserve, the department you expect. Let me be the first to say we still have a long way to go. Though we've made a lot of progress, we understand we have a long way to go. But we want to make sure that the Baltimore Police Department is a premier law enforcement agency that treats you with dignity and with respect and can reduce violence and make you safe and make you feel safe. I did a presentation about this whole Gun Trace Task Force and the report, the investigation and report, to the Major City Chiefs Association, the 75 or 80 large cities with police departments in America, to demonstrate what other chiefs should be doing, just like we did. We appreciate your support, but we appreciate your criticisms and your suggestions on how to make us better.
Commissioner, any regrets leaving New Orleans to come to Baltimore?
No regrets. No regrets.
All right. Ray Kelly.
So I just want to say that this is why we do this advocacy, because we have to continue this conversation and stay involved until we actually achieve the summit that we're looking to reach. And despite the pandemic and everything that's happened and just in Commissioner Harrison's tenure, we have to keep focused. We have to continue to engage. I was asked recently, what does community policing mean to me? And the short answer is the collaborative effort between everyone that works, lives, or worships in a city to help increase the public safety in a community. But the long answer is the continued conversation of all those people until they achieve it. Thank you guys for having me tonight.
All right, and the last word to Natasha Dorteed.
I want to say thank you to the law school and my esteemed panelists. The role of OPD is to amplify the voices of the individuals in the community. And one of the things that I would emphasize is increased transparency is extremely important. However, I am extremely hopeful, especially in what the commissioner has expressed, and I look forward to ways that we at the Office of the Public Defender can additionally collaborate to really represent and uplift the communities that we both serve.
All right. I want to offer my thanks to Heather Warnkin, Executive Director of the Center on Criminal Justice Reform. My thanks to Professor David Jaros for his faculty leadership. My thanks to the audience for being here and being so attentive and for the excellent questions. And please join me in thanking these 4 excellent panelists. I think there's some dessert outside. There's some dessert. Please enjoy the food and drink.